Hey everybody, welcome back. We are continuing on with Nietzsche. With this video, we're going to talk about Homer's Contest, another bit of early writing by Nietzsche, and we'll see some of the similar, themes and ideas that we saw in the Greek state present here as well, and a couple of additional things. So let's look at the first page of Homer's Contest. We are on, it's page 95 of the reader, first page of Homer's Contest. Let's take that first paragraph. Nietzsche writes, "If we speak of humanity, it is on the basic assumption that it should be that which separates man from nature and is his mark of distinction." So, first things first, Nietzsche's just saying, when we describe humanity, when we use the term humanity, what comes to mind is something that is distinct and separate from everything else in nature. That we have a higher set of expectations for human behavior than we do for animals and for other creatures in nature. That there's something about us that makes us not just a distinct aspect of nature, but something that is sort of fundamentally separate from nature, because we experience this phenomenon of consciousness, and so we can organize in particular ways. We come up with rationalizations, and we can develop ethics, and all this really great stuff. Right? So he says, but in reality, there is no such separation. Natural, quotes, natural characteristics are those called specifically, quote, human, have grown together inextricably, right? Inextricably. He says, man, in his highest, finest powers, is all nature and carries nature's uncanny dual character in himself. Those capacities of his which are terrible and are viewed as inhuman are perhaps, indeed, the fertile soil from which alone all humanity in feelings, deeds, and works can grow forth. So Nietzsche here is saying all that messy stuff, and maybe it's not just messy. Maybe it's the terrible stuff, the inhuman stuff. That perhaps all that stuff that we think is so terrible, and I think you could sort of, we could very easily come up with examples of this human behavior that we find, terrible. To narrow it down a little bit, acts of violence, acts of aggression, acts that are motivated by what we take to be terrible or irrational motivations of some sort. That what Nietzsche is saying is that in there might lie the very stuff that provides us with fertile soil for the great deeds and the great endeavors of humankind. So be thinking about some of the stuff that we talked about, last time that we saw in the Greek state. Nietzsche wants to pull back the veil of what we really are and what's really going on, in our lives, in our world, in our society. And he thinks that it's an illusion that we are these noble, rational creatures who have just sort of evolved and progressed to this sort of modern state of affairs, a modern society, and that we've either adequately repressed or evolved away from all of this sort of creaturely, natural, instincts, that he feels that not only are those still there, and that they are cropping up in perhaps other ways, perhaps unhealthy ways, because they've had to be sort of repressed or, redirected in insufficient ways. But perhaps that stuff that we're trying to repress and that we're trying to grow past, that in there might lie these sorts of motivations and behaviors that if we found a way to express them, I'll say in a healthy way, and this is of course going to be part of the debate. It's part of the argument. What is a healthy way? Because remember, he's using the Greeks, right? And the way that the Greeks express them, which he's going to talk about here in a second, very different from what we would seem to think is okay. And I think that's part of Nietzsche's point. But nevertheless, that if you're, and I brought this up in the past. If you say that you hate certain sorts of behaviors and certain sorts of activities, and at the same time you celebrate them by way of what you consume, by way of what entertains you, by way of what you privilege in other ways, that it should be indicating something to you, and that may not be the healthiest. It may not be the healthiest practice. But we're not going to try to solve it. Let's try to understand what Nietzsche is saying. So I'm gonna move on. If you drop down, he uses an example from Alexander the Great. That's him sort of imitating something that Achilles did or was supposed to have done. But let's drop about halfway into that next paragraph. He says, "Here we look into the abysses of hatred. With the same sensation we observe the bloody and insatiable mutual laceration of two Greek factions, for example in the Corcyraean Revolution, when in a battle between cities, the victor, according to the rights of war, put the whole male population to the sword and sells all the women and children into slavery. We see, in the sanctioning of such a right, that the Greek regarded a full release of his hatred as a serious necessity. At such moments, pent-up, swollen sensation found relief. The tiger charged out, wanton cruelty flickering in its terrible eyes." I mean, Nietzsche's saying that it seemed as though the Greeks knew something that that we don't, or we've forgotten, and that is that it is necessary to unleash one's aggression. That doesn't mean that it is admirable in the usual ways that we talk about it being admirable. I don't. It's not as though they didn't know that it was evil. It's not as though they didn't know that it was terrible. It's not as though they didn't realize that this is an aspect or an expression of the tragic nature of life. But rather, that doesn't change the fact that it's necessary. That that part of being a human being is having feelings, and those feelings needing to be expressed. And what Nietzsche is saying is we don't have adequate means of doing that. That the means that we have are unhealthy means, and that our societal morality, that our societal practices, that what is acceptable behavior, what is it acceptable, what sorts of things can you indulge or engage in, what do people think is like good and healthy, where are the lines drawn, and again, let's not read too much into this, in as much as it's like, okay, no more rules, everybody just go crazy. That's not what Nietzsche is saying. He's using the Greeks to critique the present, and and to do that, we have to have a better understanding of the Greeks, who we, on one hand, we associate with these vast powers of the mind and all the wonderful things that we've gotten from them. We've mentioned them before. But at the same time, here's a culture that was engaged in war, was engaged in slavery, was engaged in really brutal practices, and it was just something that people understood, that that's just the way that life is, and that if we didn't do these things, what would happen? What would happen to the health of that culture? And, we could probably mount some pretty good counter arguments. But this is part of what makes Nietzsche a, aristocratic, dangerous philosopher, and that he's raising uncomfortable issues, not so that we become inhuman and monstrous, but we reconsider the necessity of healthy releases of certain types of, you know, um, tensions, and that this will impact the types of uh, not only cultural practices, but specifically, like, this is going to play into the health of the state as a militaristic entity, and various other sort of institutions and systems that comprise the state, and of course the all important stuff that we talked about last time, like, the art. What are the plays and the novels and the poetry and the music, and today, the films and the games, like, what is this all an expression of a healthy culture? So I'm gonna carry on. I feel like this is something that we could really take a lot of time to parse out, so that we don't have a too simplistic sense of what he's saying. Because at face value, it sounds like Nietzsche's saying, let's just turn towards the monstrous, and, like, everybody, go crazy. And I don't think that that's what he's saying. But he is challenging, not unlike in some respects what Nietzsche was, what Emerson was, um, and other people this time were as well, and to this day. And that is, there's a conforming, subordinated type of conventional thinking and behavior that does not serve the people. It doesn't serve the health of the people. Now, on one hand, Nietzsche obviously has a sense of the herd, of the masses, and okay, fine, right? You do that stuff, but that perhaps there are others in society that need to um, resist and overcome that. So to what degree what he's talking about here affects everyone, that I'm not sure, except he's going to say here in a page or two that there are these motivations that need to be acted upon, whether or not we're talking about violence aside, when it comes to competition. And that we're going to feed off of that stuff that traditional ethics or morality or religion has tried to basically, excise from us, or have us repress. But he wants to say that that stuff actually drives us to greatness. But I'm going to read here a little bit more. The bottom couple of lines of this page, he says, "I fear we have not understood these in a sufficiently Greek way, and even if we should shudder, even that we would shudder if we ever did understand them in a Greek way." So the issues that he's raising as a matter of interpretation is one in which we are 21st century, um, you know, readers, interpreters, going back to the Greeks of 2,500 years ago. And we're sort of only understanding them within a sort of horizon of understanding based on our own experience. And that, so we're not understanding the Greeks from a Greek perspective, we're understanding them from our perspective. And while in some ways that's necessarily so, there is perhaps an imaginative, closely attuned, based off of more reading and more thinking about it, in which one could do a better job of sort of coming closer to understanding the Greeks, as a Greek, again, to a certain limited extent, and that we would see them very differently, and we would judge them very differently. And we even carry some similar idea when we talk about walking a mile in someone else's shoes, or putting ourselves in someone else's situation. It's still a sort of imagined, empathetic act. We can't really do it, but it's something that we can strive to do. And why would we want to understand the Greeks from a Greek perspective? Perhaps so that we didn't automatically judge and dismiss things that we didn't fully understand because of our own biases. That would be why. And so that whatever it is that they have to teach us, that otherwise we wouldn't hear or see or seriously consider because of those biases, that perhaps that can be overcome. And so that we can possibly learn from them. And even if the main thing that we learn about them is just how alien they are from us and how different we are from them. And so we don't just see them as people like us who lived a long time ago. We realize that perhaps that's a bit of a misconception, perhaps a little bit of an illusion as well. On page 96, if you drop down about halfway into that top paragraph, he writes, "Let us imagine the air of Hesiod's poems, difficult to breathe as it is, still thicker and darker, and without any of the things to alleviate and cleanse it, which poured over Hellas from Delphi, and numerous seats of the gods. Let us mix this thickened Boeotian air with the dark voluptuousness of the Etruscans. Such a reality would then extort from us a world of myths in which Uranus, Kronos, and Zeus, and the struggles of the Titans would seem like a relief. In this brooding atmosphere," and note this, "combat is salvation and deliverance. The cruelty of the victory is the pinnacle of life's jubilation, and just as, in truth, the concept of Greek law developed out of murder and atonement for murder, finer culture, too, takes its first victor's wreath from the altar of atonement for murder. The wake of that bloody period stretches deep into Hellenic history. The names of Orpheus, Musaeus, and their cults reveal that were the conclusions to which a continual exposure to a world of combat and cruelty led, to nausea at existence, to the view of existence as a punishment to be discharged by serving out one's time, to the belief that existence and indebtedness were identical." So, what he's getting at here is that what the actual world in which the Greeks lived is, and this is, we see this in their art and in their stories, that what we see is they learned that, and a hard lesson, that combat is salvation, that conflict and victory in conflict, that this is everything, right? That they must wage war. They must win their conflicts because their very life, their very health, perhaps their sense of identity is at stake. That they must fight, and that it's not the aversion of fighting that's salvation, but taking up the fight that is salvation. And he goes on to say that in this world, the what does he say? He says, just as in truth the concept of Greek law developed out of murder and atonement for murder. Like, why have laws at all? It arises in a world in which murder happens, and that one must atone for that murder, right? And this becomes the sort of basic activity, again, as terrible as it is, out of which a philosophy of law and the necessity of law would even arise. Like, what's the purpose of a law? Why do we have them? Is it because, we're just trying to make people better? Or is it because there seems to be something about our creaturely condition in which we're caught up in conflict that often leads to various forms of violence and piracy and usurpation, bloodshed, all of that stuff, right? But how can we live together with all of those tendencies? With all of those historic patterns of behavior of the species. He goes on to say here in what we read. He says, what the poets, what the thinkers, what the artists, what they come to, the conclusion they come to is, they become nauseated at existence, and they say it's the belief that existence is a punishment, that you have to serve your time out, and that existence and indebtedness were identical. So, something like this. Your existence is a crime against being, right? And that the penalty for this crime is death. What does that mean? that means everything that comes into being passes out of being. Nothing abides. The mountains don't abide. The long-lived trees don't abide. Humans don't either. And that while we think of it like in biological terms, we think of it in like some other sort of way. The Greeks give us a view of mortality not biologically, but in terms of justice. And it's a sort of alternative account for getting our heads around, why it is that humans die, and what it means that humans die. And while we think that we have a default position of that our lives are inherently dignified and have value and meaning, and we don't have to really do anything, we just got to like live and like we're important and we're special. Nietzsche's pointing out that the Greeks knew that that just wasn't true. That if anything, your existence is a crime, and you're going to pay for it, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's just what's gonna happen. And who knows when it's going to happen, right? There's all sorts of things that you don't control. It can be a cruel world, right? And this isn't glorifying it as though this is like a wonderful thing. It's a terrible thing, and they realize that as well. But if existence is identical with indebtedness, this means that you have to somehow pay that debt off, which means perhaps you gotta die well. You basically have to fight. You have to like earn the little bit of time that you have if it's going to be justified, or if it's got any shot at being something that's dignified or remarkable or worthy. You got to do more than just be yourself. You got to do something else. If you look down, he's going to start talking about, and you need to mark this. He's going to talk about Eris, this goddess, and he's going to talk about two different sort of variations of this goddess, which you'll need to take note of. I'm reading from the bottom paragraph on page 96. He says, when the traveler Pausanias visited the Helicon on his travels through Greece, an ancient copy of the Greek's first didactic poem, Hesiod's Works and Days, was shown to him, inscribed on lead plates and badly damaged by time and weather. But he still saw this much, that in contrast to the usual copies, it did not carry the little hymn to Zeus at the head, but began straight with the assertion, there are two Eris goddesses on earth. Now, I wanted to read this just to say, imagine running across a really famous book, whether or not you've even read it before, but you know how it begins. And what if you picked up a copy and it had a completely different beginning, right? This would be, like, I don't know, opening up the Bible and instead of it saying, like in the beginning, like it started some other way, right? Or, it was the best of times and the worst of times, it says something else. That this is remarkable because it's an alternative account, and so we should like take that. Well, what's this alternative account? And what is it? Is that instead of Hesiod's Works and Days beginning with this sort of like hymn to Zeus, praising Zeus, it begins by the assertion that there are two Eris goddesses, not one Eris goddess. He says. This is one of the most remarkable of Hellenic ideas and deserves to be impressed upon newcomers right at the gate of entry to Hellenic ethics. One should praise the one Eris as much as blame the other, if one has any sense, because the two goddesses have quite separate dispositions. One promotes wicked war and feuding, the cruel thing. No mortal likes her, but the yoke of necessity forces man to honor the heavy burden of this Eris according to the degrees of the immortals. Black Night gave birth to this one as the elder of the two, but Zeus. So the first one is like bad, like wickedness, war, is going to lead to bloodshed. That this Eris follows with Ares, into war. And so like we don't like this Eris. There's nothing good that we can think of that comes with this Eris. But Zeus, who reigned on high, placed the other Eris on the roots of the earth and amongst men as a much better one. She drives even the unskilled man to work. And if someone who lacks property sees someone else who's rich, He likewise hurries off to show and plant and set his house in order. Neighbor competes with neighbor for prosperity. This heiress is good for men. So basically, this other one represents a sort of healthy expression of something like envy, of the desire to compete. That it's what within us. It's what's within us. This heiress is obviously a myth, but that she signifies a sort of natural force or drive or inclination to not settle, but upon encountering someone else's success or talent, or abilities, that we don't just go, oh, that's nice. That we go, damn, like I want that, or I want to be that good, or I can do better than that. Whatever the case could be. I mean, and this is, we see this obviously still present in sport, right? Like teams compete, and they don't compete to lose, they compete to win. They don't compete just to play well. And there's certainly an enlightened view of competition in which one can derive pleasure just from the game itself and from the competition, good competition. But that what's still sort of driving it is the desire to win, like playing a game. And what Nietzsche is saying is that this is good and this is healthy. And it should be something that is involved in all the different areas of life, not just sort of like the ones that are approved. He talks about how this goes to, what does he talks about? Potters and, carpenters and, anybody on any level, whether they're doing manual labor or intellectual work or whatever, right? And this is good for us. In the next paragraph, if you drop down to the middle of the next paragraph, he says, and not just Aristotle, but the whole of Greek antiquity thinks about grudge and envy differently from us and agrees with Hesiod, who first portrays one heiress as wicked, in fact, the one who leads men into the hostile struggle to death, and then, so that's bad, then praises the other heiress as good, who as jealousy, grudge, or envy goads men to action. Not, however, in the action of a struggle to death, but the action of the contest. And so this makes this heiress a benevolent deity, he says, and he notes how different, how wide the gulf is between us and the ancient Greeks that understood this. That, they saw this as not something to be overcome or to be repressed or whatever, but this is what drives them to greatness. Let's go to page 98. Let's see here. He talks about competition and its relationship to the ostracon or ostracism, and it's when we think of ostracism, we think of people that are different, and so we ostracize them because they're different, they don't fit in. But the origins of it, and we see this on page 98, the origin of it actually lies in ostracizing the best. Now, that might sound as though it's somehow, conflicting with what we're saying here. But Nietzsche's point is that it's the competition that's great. And if someone is so good that they dry up the competition, within the state, within the context of whatever we're talking about, that's not good, right? This would be one of the reasons why, if we were to use an economic model, this is one of the reasons that a monopoly isn't good, is it dries up the competition that's supposed to keep things, moving. It's supposed to be good for prices and the quality of the product and the balance between the two and meeting people's needs and all that stuff, right? That there's something about keeping the competition going. And so if someone becomes so good that there's no more competition, we send them away. And he says, for why should nobody be the best? This is that second paragraph on 98. Because with that, the contest would dry up and the permanent basis of life in the Hellenic state would be endangered. Right? So let's talk. So obviously we want people's talents to be cultivated. We want them to drive. We want them to be driven to be their best. And let's look at an area where this we don't often think about it this way. Some people do, but if you drop down to the third paragraph, he says Hellenic popular teaching commands that every talent must develop through struggle, right? And then drop down a few more lines. He says, but for the ancients, the aim of agonistic education, right? Like agonistic education, struggle, right? Pain, agony, right? In education. I know that you're so excited right now. The idea of an agonistic education. He says, was the well-being of the whole of the state society. For example, every Athenian was to develop himself through competition to the degree to which this self, was of most use to Athens and would cause least damage. I imagine that most of you are, at school for very personal, selfish reasons, right? And I'm not even trying to use that in a necessarily negative way. It's like you got to think about yourself, and like you need a job, and this is part of this process by which you learn how to do something, and you're transitioning from being young to being not as young, and this passage into being an active sort of employed citizen, in the state. And what he's saying is that the ancient Greek, the ancient Athenian, was driven to become the best possible version of themselves through competition, through contest with their peers, so that they wouldn't be a burden to the state, but that they would, in fact, be an instrument of salvation. He says a few lines down near the bottom of the page, from childhood, every Greek felt the burning desire within him to be an instrument of bringing salvation to his city in the contest between cities. That they weren't just, it wasn't about status, and it wasn't about just getting a job. That education for them was about becoming the most excellent version of themselves possible. Powers of the mind, powers of speech, athletic ability, like whatever it is. Obviously, we're not the Greeks, and so we'd have to correlate this, to today. But the idea of it being that your education should be making you someone who actually contributes to the welfare of everyone, right? Which is an idea not dissimilar than we heard when we were actually reading a Greek, when we were reading Plato. And Nietzsche's sort of drawing out perhaps an unheeded or an unspoken element in it, and that is that there's a necessity of contest to bring this out. So be thinking about the agonistic aspect of your education. Do you want everything to be as easy as possible? Do you look for ways to get out of struggle so that you don't have to think, that you don't have to work, that you don't have to try harder to become better? And what impact is it not only having on you and your development, but then what is that going to do for you as someone who's contributing, not just as a engineer, or not just as a designer of some sort, or not just as a whatever, right? But as a citizen who must sort of be familiar with the whole host of historic, social, political issues, have some spiritual disposition towards life. And if you want to take it seriously, if you want to have a better place in which you live, and to be a member of a community, that you would have to maybe reformulate your thoughts about this. The last thing that I'll mention here is on the bottom of page 99, and this is going back to that point about the best and the ostracism. He says, last few lines on 99, and this divine envy flares up when it sees a man without any other competitor, without an opponent, at the lonely height of fame. He only has the gods near him now, and for that reason he has them against them. But these entice him into an act of hubris, and he collapses under it. I mean, this is speaking to the necessity of rivals. Um, there's an aphorism in the gay science that we might look at. Um, Star friendship is what it's referred to as. But the idea here is that rivals aren't something to overcome and never have anymore. That we need rivals because we need competition for our health, for the health of our society. And again, this is all what Nietzsche is arguing, by his understanding of the Greeks. That if one leaves behind all rivals and overcomes all rivals, and has no opponents, that as Nietzsche says here, that then they only have the gods, right, to contend with. And if that's the case, then the gods are against him, right? And this is a really interesting way of understanding, hubris. That's ultimately what the downfall is. That they have no mortal can challenge them, and so really it's just them that overcome themselves, right? The gods undo them through this sin, this hamartia of hubris. Yeah, and that's why it's sort of the one of the ways of thinking about the tragic flaw, as Aristotle talks about it. In any case, I hope that gives you some provocative and interesting things to think about, perhaps to reflect on. Again, agreement or disagreement aside, that these are really interesting ideas, and so hopefully you got something out of it. So until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and I'll see you soon.